Well, we're missing one of our speakers, but he's the fourth speaker, so we'll go ahead and start, and he'll catch up with us. As I mentioned at the outset, the book's divided into three parts. The program here is also divided into three parts, the first part of which was Larry, and he's now departed. So now we're going to pick up from the book itself two sections. The first is an appraisal of the Plaza, asking how successful was it, why was it successful, what shortcomings did it have, what was the 30-year retrospective yielding in terms of analysis that then provides the foundation for the second panel, the last part of the book, lessons for the future and what we can do from now, drawing on the experience of the past. We've got a super panel of 4 people, each of whom will speak for 10 to 12 minutes, and then we'll have plenty of time for discussion. The first speaker is Jim Boughton, Boughton, right? Yeah, Jim Boughton, who is well known to everybody in this business as the historian of the International Monetary Fund. I know people at the U.S. Treasury and the Federal Reserve and everywhere else have as their Bibles on the IMF the works of Jim, who literally was the historian of the fund for about 20 years, after having worked in other parts of the fund itself for many years as well. He's written 2 volumes on IMF history, different periods of time. He has done a number of books on other IMF topics, and he is literally the expert on the record, the results, the role of the IMF historically. He probably had some negative reaction to Larry's comment that keeping the fund out was a part of the success of the Plaza. We'll hear from him on that. Our second speaker is Russell Green. Both Adam and I already referred to him earlier. He spoke, gave us a few words earlier. Russell, in addition to being the organizer of the conference and his Rice Institute being the co-sponsor, did a superb paper in the volume. I commend it to you. It's a very comprehensive analysis of the Plaza Agreement itself, and Russell will share the results of that with us. He's the Will Clayton Fellow in International Economics at Rice University's Baker Institute. He's also an adjunct professor in the economics department at Rice, where he teaches international finance and macro. Before moving into that academic and think tank world, Russell spent 4 years in India as the Treasury Department's first financial attaché there, and he helped organize, in fact, the U.S.-India Economic and Financial Partnership, which continues to have annual dialogue discussions today. Russell had spent some time in the Office of International Monetary Policy at the Treasury before going to India, there with responsibilities for IMF, exchange rate policies, international reserve management, and the like. Russell did his PhD at University of California in Berkeley. Our third speaker will be Karen Johnson. Karen retired from the IMF from the Federal Reserve in 2008 and is a self-employed economic consultant now. But for many years, she was at the top or right at the top of the international division of the Federal Reserve. She was the director of that division from 1998 until 2007, just before her retirement. And she had spent earlier periods in charge of the industrial countries section and other key components of the Division of International Finance. She did her PhD at MIT. She taught at Stanford before moving to the Fed in 1979 and making her career thereafter. Our fourth speaker, who asked a question of Larry before, is Dave Smick. Dave's a close friend of Adam, myself, all of us here at the Institute. He's chairman and CEO of Johnson Smick International, which advises some of the world's largest and most important private investors. He authored most recently a national bestseller titled The World is Curved, Hidden Dangers to the Global Economy, and he's had several books before that. His book, The World is Curved, was called by Bill Clinton, no less, one of the top 3 books on the global financial crisis, and David Brooks, from a slightly different perspective, called it astonishingly prescient. So many kudos to Dave for that vibe. Dave also is the founder, editor, and publisher of the quarterly magazine, The International Economy, which he launched back in 1987, and which he always cites a little blurb from me on the back cover saying it's the only must-read in this business, which I find it to be, and I do always read it because it's got gems every quarter that are extremely worthwhile. For today's purposes, Dave has a particular relevance, and Adam alluded to that. In the period before the Plaza, there were a series of international conferences sponsored by 2 congressional leaders, Congressman Jack Kemp and Senator Bill Bradley. And those conferences were essentially organized by David and a colleague of his at the time. And that series, which attracted the world's top experts and most influential people, had an important impact in developing the intellectual consensus and basis on which the Plaza and subsequent events took place. So Dave, in addition to all his other attributes, has a very direct relevance to what we're talking about today. It's great to have him on the panel. So, with no further ado, each will speak for 10 to 12 minutes. We'll then open it up for discussion in the group and look forward to getting their assessments of how successful was the Plaza. Jim.
Okay, thank you, Fred. It's always an honor to be invited to speak at the Peterson Institute, and I always manage to get to reconnect with a lot of old friends and colleagues, and so it's a great pleasure for me to be here. I should say that in addition to viewing the Plaza Agreement from the vantage of an historian who's written about it, I was also I wouldn't say I had a front seat at in the events leading up to and surrounding the Plaza, but I at least had a back seat for about a year or so before the Plaza meeting took place. I was in charge of a small group in the research department at the IMF that was charged with doing regular analysis of exchange rate and current account developments among the major industrial countries. And throughout that year, from around the middle of 1984, we were increasingly alarmed about the growing evidence of a bubble in the dollar exchange rate and the consequences that could have, as Fred and other speakers have mentioned earlier, to sort of raise protectionist threats in Congress and so on. But none of us understood what was going on in these exchange markets. Why was the dollar so strong? And then we saw James Baker come in and begin to push things back in the other direction. So it was a very exciting time to be following these developments. But and it led to an increasing urgency about the whole economic modeling effort in the IMF. And but I have to emphasize that we were aware at the time that we did not understand what was going on. I don't think anybody else really understood what was going on either. But there's nothing economists love better than new data, especially if it's in the midst of a crisis. So it was really a great time to be working on it. Later on, when I became the IMF historian, I wrote a history of the 1980s and Chapter 4 in that history, which I called Silent Revolution. Chapter 4 deals with the whole economic cooperation effort among the large countries, with the whole period from the Plaza to the Louvre being a central part of that. And I don't think I interviewed quite as many people as Funabashi did when he was writing his book for Fred, but I did interview most of the key participants. Interviewed Baker, Volcker, Mulford from the U.S., Stoltenberg and Tietmeyer from Germany, Toyo Gyoten, Utsumi from Japan, Nigel Lawson, Jeffrey Littler, and others from the U.K. And it was a lot of fun to do. So most of what I learned about the Plaza is in that chapter, if anybody's interested in following up. But looking back on it now, from 30 years later, I would say if you take the long historical approach, while those of us writing about it at the time and a little bit afterwards focused on a lot of the details about, and a lot of this is in this new book as well, what exactly did the Plaza meeting achieve, what did it fail to achieve, and so on. But I think that's overshadowed by the whole question now of what lessons we can draw about under what conditions international cooperation can work, and under what conditions does it not work, and then what implications does this have for the future. So I draw 4 key lessons, which I'm now going to describe very briefly. The first lesson I draw is that if you're going to have international cooperation on economic policy, you have to have good models, and people have to agree about those models. And if you look back on the period before the Plaza Agreement, this was a major issue because our models were wrong, and there was a lot of dispute about these models. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, most of the economics profession thought that in the long run, exchange rates would equilibrate trade positions and current accounts, and that there was a self-equilibrating process in financial markets that would lead, at least eventually, to the right kinds of exchange rates prevailing. We now know that exchange rates can be permanently hijacked by the capital account, and that the trade account just then has to kind of follow along to whatever is going on in the capital account. But that wasn't well understood. So if you're going to try to have international cooperation, you're going to be basing it on models that have since been largely discredited. So that was a problem in the period leading up to and surrounding the Plaza. But the other thing that was going on was there was a lot of work in those years about, a lot of thinking going on about whether foreign exchange market intervention was a helpful part of the economic policy toolkit. And in those debates, there was not even agreement as to what people were talking about. So it wasn't as if we'd say, well, let's define the problem, and then maybe the U.S. has one view on it, that exchange market intervention doesn't work. Europeans have another view, exchange market intervention does work. The whole language that people were using to describe this was different in the 2 parts of the world. You had one group over here who had grown up reading Hemingway and studying Tom Sargent, and you had another group in other parts of the world that had grown up reading Proust or Thomas Mann and studying Maurice Allais, and so having a dialogue between them wasn't very helpful. It was interesting when Larry mentioned cultural norms as evolving as part of the process today. If he had used that kind of language in the U.S. government in the early 1980s, he would have been laughed out of the room, but it would have been much more at home in Europe. So I'm not convinced that this kind of problem has gone away. We might have moved a little bit closer between the U.S. and Europe, but if you think about what it might take to have a real serious dialogue between U.S. policymakers and Chinese policymakers today, I think the danger that people are really working with different models and speaking different languages, literally, but also figuratively about language, is a problem. So that's a barrier to policy cooperation that I think needs to be taken into account. Secondly, you not only need good economic models, but you need good role models. One thing that isn't discussed very much in this book, for all of its strengths, is the failure of the Bonn Summit in 1978 as having had lingering effects, discouraging people from even thinking about policy cooperation for years afterwards. The Bonn Summit was informed a lot by the McCracken report. I brought this along today because I have what is probably the last remaining copy of the McCracken report in private hands. But I kept this over the years because I was at the OECD at the time, and I worked in a small way on this report. And what this report did, and what people tried to do at the Bonn Summit in 1978, was to basically pressure Germany into taking more expansionary policies because growth had slowed down so much in Germany that was a major drag on world economic growth. And so there was an agreement in that summit meeting that Germany would take more of a locomotive approach to try to lead to more expansion, and at the same time the U.S. would do more to try to rein in its inflationary policies. And it failed because everybody overestimated how much growth potential there really was in the German economy, and the failure of that led to a discouraging view about economic policy making for many years afterwards. We actually, at the OECD, we called this the Coordinated Recovery Action Program. That was what was supposed to come out of the Bonn Summit. And the initials of that are CRAP, which I may tell you something about our view of the process. I had a colleague at the OECD who spent the better part of an afternoon trying to come up with a French version of that would spell out merde, but he never quite succeeded in making it work. So I think now these problems continue. But moving on, the third lesson I draw from all this is that cooperation requires trust. One of the reasons that the Plaza Agreement was a success, and that process then led to another 18 months or so of successful cooperation through the period of the Louvre Agreement, was that you had a group of people who were working well together. You had Baker, Miyazawa, and Stoltenberg, Mulford, Utsumi, Guillotin, Tietmeyer, and so on. Were all people who had similar views about things, were willing to work together. But more generally, you had, if you're going to have international cooperation, people have to pretend to be all working together to try to promote the global welfare. But everybody involved also understands that everybody else is actually working to promote their own national interests. And usually cooperation breaks down because everybody else understands that the U.S. wants cooperation in order to co-opt everybody else to try to promote U.S. economic interests. And it's only when those interests tend to coincide, as they did at the time of the Plaza, and they continue to do through the period of the Louvre, that you can develop the kind of trust to make this work. But I think the lesson for that, the reason it's important to understand this, is that this kind of trust can never persist because national interests only coincide for brief periods, and the kind of lack of clashing personalities that often prevails doesn't persist. My final lesson is cooperation requires leadership. Now, that's an obvious point, but I think it's important to keep in mind because one of the problems in making this kind of process persist was that at the time of the Plaza, you had one group trying to coordinate policies at the summit level, which was the G7, and then you had a smaller group of people trying to co-opt the process through the G5 for their finance meetings. And one of the successes of the Louvre was that it then brought these two groups together because they expanded the finance ministers into the G7, but you lost the intimacy of the G5 when you did that. And so in a way it was a success, but without the kind of overall leadership of the process continuing, it didn't really continue. And so if we look forward, we see that over the period for several years, 9 years really, leading up to the global financial crisis in 2008, we had the opposite gap prevailing. So at the finance ministry from 1999 through 2007, finance ministers were meeting primarily in the form of the G20. But the G7 and then the G8 continued to meet at the summit level as the main grouping there. And so it wasn't until 2008 that at the summit level they decided to begin meeting as the G20 as well. And so we have these two episodes where there was a major effort to try to bring these groups together, but the groups themselves can't persist. And that would lead to the point that Fred was trying to goad me into talking about, which I won't talk about now, but hopefully it will come up in the course of our discussion later, that we do have a treaty-based permanent global institution whose main purpose is to try to promote this kind of international cooperation through an existing forum, and of course that's the International Monetary Fund. And so the whole question about why the IMF fails as an institution, or is perceived to fail as an institution that can do this by itself, and why you need to have a kind of much smaller steering committee to try to take it over, but that group excludes other countries. It's impermanent. It depends on personalities to a much greater extent than the permanent institution. You have that clash, and that has to somehow be resolved if international cooperation is really going to work. So those are my key lessons. Thank you.
Well, thank you again for having me here today. I was noting that I'm a bit of an outlier in the study of the Plaza Accord, because for me this is all economic history, and so to be here where most people that you're going to hear from today were already active economists and lived through this firsthand, it's a little bit bold for me to be taking much of a stand on these issues, and so it's for me it's an act of writing about economic history, since I was essentially in high school during the Plaza. But so with that caveat, let me attempt to give my impression of this question about whether the Plaza Accord was a success. So let me first say that I'll slightly disagree with Fred's characterization in that I don't think there's a big spoiler alert if you read the book that there is necessarily a complete consensus on whether the Plaza Accord was a success. But part of the reason for that is because there's so many different ways that you can define success of something as kind of diverse as the Plaza Accord. And so most of the chapters in the book address this question, at least briefly, but it's not clear to me that we necessarily came to a complete consensus. In fact, there are still remaining areas of controversy about the Plaza Accord. So I think one way that we can all agree that the Plaza Accord was a success is that it was very much a public relations success, in the sense that the finance ministries and central banks that were involved in the Plaza Accord got a lot of credit for what happened to foreign exchange markets in 1985. But it was that perception, the popular perception of success of the Plaza Accord, that then created the desire on other people's parts, notably Marty Feldstein, to come out and claim that the emperor has no clothes. That in fact the Plaza Accord, for all of its glitz, had very little to do with what really happened in foreign exchange markets in 1985. So that controversy still exists, and I think you pick up pieces of that in the volume, that people today are still not 100% convinced of whether the specific coordination actually mattered for what happened in foreign exchange markets. But I think we can still agree that the Plaza Accord was a public relations success, and I don't, in this town, I don't think I have to remind everybody that often it's the perception of what happened that matters much more than what actually happened. And I think for the Plaza Accord, that really is the case, that the popular perception that the finance ministers, Jim Baker and the Japanese side, get a lot of credit for having really masterfully managed what was quite obviously a bubble in the foreign exchange market with a very strong dollar. For having very adeptly managed that, they got a lot of credit. And I think part of why that really matters is that they took that credit on board and internalized it, and it created a lot more enthusiasm for active exchange rate management than had existed. And so Jim had mentioned the fact that we had a lack of good role models leading into the 80s because of the lack of success of the 1978 efforts. Certainly in the first Reagan administration, for ideological reasons, there was no enthusiasm for foreign exchange intervention. And so there wasn't any momentum going into the Plaza Accord for coordination. So having then had this very successful round of foreign exchange intervention that was obviously very, very much coordinated, there was this new round of enthusiasm for active exchange rate management. And so what I want to talk about today a little bit is these two, sort of as there's so many ways that you can evaluate the Plaza, sort of look at it in terms of how the Plaza Accord impacted from sort of a long-run standpoint this belief in active exchange rate management among major economies. So, it had required a lot of political skill for James Baker to get the U.S. administration on board with the Plaza Accord initially. But after it was such a success, suddenly the Reagan administration was much more willing to support active exchange rate management. And so there was a lot of momentum for coordination, but equally importantly, James Baker had seen that there was this usefulness of using the dollar as a negotiating tool, right? And so initially he used the threat of protectionism coming out of Congress as a way to pull countries on board. But once he had the G5 on board with the Plaza, he then held out the prospect of this Plaza Accord as a way to get further concessions from the Germans and the Japanese for more fiscal stimulus. So something sort of akin to what happened with the locomotive strategy in 1978. And so I think that part of the enthusiasm, the Treasury enthusiasm for exchange rate was realizing that this is such a useful, that once you buy into active exchange rate management and to coordination, that you can really use it as a powerful lever. Now, of course, about 6 months after the Plaza, the dollar had fallen really quite far. The Japanese were asking for help for preventing further yen appreciation, and this gave Baker the leverage to then extract further concessions from the Japanese in terms of pushing more stimulative policies in the Japanese economy in exchange for agreeing to go along with further coordination to help prevent the dollar from falling further. Of course, Fumio Hayashi's book gives a lot more detail on this process and what happened. Now, as we know, this then led into the Tokyo Summit and the Louvre Accord, right? And this was essentially a 2-year experiment with much more coordinated exchange rates, which, as international economists, we love to investigate this period because it was fairly unique historically. But it's probably not too controversial to say that the experiment didn't turn out as well as folks hoped, but there were tremendous learnings from it. And I'm going to attribute those learnings essentially to how the Plaza had started it. We learned that domestic political and economic compulsions are going to override even the most carefully constructed arrangements for exchange rate coordination. Now, of course, there's some folks at the Peterson Institute who feel like they've got a plan for coordinated, a more carefully designed scheme than the Louvre. I'm not sure how that would work in practice, if that could work in practice. I'm perhaps a little bit more skeptical. I guess I should also say that any learnings that we gathered from that Plaza Louvre experiment, maybe learnings isn't really the right word, because Barry Eichengreen in our book does a really good job of demonstrating that all of those lessons that we got from the Plaza Accord you really could have found in previous historical examples. And so maybe the way to characterize the learnings from that Plaza Louvre experiment is that it was really not so much a new learning as a very strong reminder that there are these powerful constraints to how much coordination is really going to work, how much room there is for coordination to be successful. And different from perhaps those past historical lessons from the 30s and the 70s, the lessons that we got from the Louvre, from the Plaza Louvre period, really seem to have stuck in the sense of we haven't had that much ambition for coordination since then. And I suspect that lesson about the fact that domestic compulsions really tend to override your external ambition probably provided some of the momentum in the creation of the euro area. And so I credit the Plaza as having been the success, the public relations success of the Plaza, as having really provided the impetus for that whole experiment from which we learned a lot of lessons. Now, even after that experiment ended, sometime towards the end of Reagan's second term, the major economic finance ministers continued to believe, at least if not in coordination, at least in active exchange rate management. Right? So they may have given up on this idea of a grand scheme, but the levels of intervention were still really large, and ideologically or intellectually, there was still this belief that intervention by major economies can work, that it not only can correct market movements, market overshooting, but even that it can affect trade imbalances if you have active exchange rate management in the right way. And so it was still part of the toolkit for active, say, real economy management. Now, the problem then was that active exchange rate management didn't necessarily align well with monetary policy. And so central banks did not always like this form of active exchange rate management. And in fact, by the early 1990s, the Fed had really had enough. Right? And so what had always happened in the U.S. is that the Treasury Department and the Fed always intervene at the same time when they intervene in exchange rate markets from separate accounts, but they intervene together. But by the early 1990s, the Fed essentially revolted and said to the Treasury, "We're not going to continue to intervene with you. You're on your own." Too often, they, I guess, had found that they were intervening in domestic markets in one direction and in the foreign exchange market in another direction. And they felt like it was confusing their message. This is a story that Ted Truman and Michael Bordeaux, among others, have told. And that really, I don't think has necessarily gotten the attention that it deserves. But that, essentially, for the U.S. was the death knell. When the Fed revolted, was the death knell of active exchange rate management. You see a little bit of intervention on into the early 90s, but it really had tempered down. Now, the same thing had happened in Japan, but the Bank of Japan didn't have the autonomy to revolt, right? And so, as we heard earlier, the Bank of Japan went along with intervention to prevent yen appreciation. And essentially that was a mistake because the Bank of Japan was supporting loose monetary policy into what was already a booming economy. And with history, we know that was a mistake. But because of the lack of independence in the Bank of Japan, the correction couldn't come directly from the Bank of Japan, but had to go through the legislative process. And so it wasn't until 1998 that the Bank of Japan got a legal expansion of its autonomy that then sort of prevents that from happening again. But I think it's this need for alignment of domestic monetary policy with any active exchange rate management that I believe is a big factor in the potential for coordinated intervention today. And that is, you have to look at what is the monetary policy stance in all these countries, and how would any sort of potential agreement or conspiracy or whatever or repetition of the Plaza, how would that line up with monetary policy? And I think clearly it's not a propitious moment at the moment to see a similar alignment of interests. Now, in our overview of the book, Fred and I talk about several meanings of the Plaza. So there's, and I commend that first chapter to you. There's the short-term Plaza, what happened in 1985 with exchange rate markets. There's sort of the medium-term meaning of the Plaza with the Plaza Louvre experiment. And then there's the sort of the long-run impact of the Plaza as it established the G5 as sort of the high table, the formal high table of finance. It brought the fund, as Larry mentioned, the fund in that macroeconomic process with the G7. It was that Plaza Louvre experiment that brought the fund into the process. So it sort of established a lot of the structures that we saw today. Now, I mentioned that for at least the medium-term Plaza, that that essentially we learned a lot from it, right? That's kind of a euphemism for saying it probably wasn't a big success. That medium-term Plaza Louvre experiment with heightened coordination probably wasn't a very big success. And in fact, we really haven't looked back. Once that enthusiasm tapered, we really haven't looked back from a policymaker standpoint very seriously about that. So I guess that's kind of my assessment of whether the Plaza Accord was a success, was focusing on that, not the controversial short-run Plaza, but the sort of medium-run Plaza. And it had very long legacy into the 90s, really. So it was very important, but I'm not sure if it was necessarily a success. Thanks.
Thanks to Fred for introducing us, and thanks to the PIIE for inviting me to participate here. And apologies for my voice, which is somewhat raspy owing to some combination of allergies and a cold, and I haven't sorted that out yet. I very much enjoyed the chance to read the volume, and for me, it was a walk down memory lane. I was not an active participant at the level at which the Louvre and the Plaza and the Louvre took place, but I was at the Fed, and I was very much involved in the discussions there and the awareness of what was going on day by day. The question this panel has been asked is, how successful was the Plaza? Implicit in that question are the issues of in what way and why. My answer is a qualified yes. It was a success. It was a success in that it did contribute to resolving tensions at the time, most particularly those associated with the protectionism pressure. It did lead to some external adjustment. It voiced awareness and raised the profile of the conversation about monetary and fiscal policy concerning the G5 countries. And it provided a context for global economic leadership, and that context was needed. I'm fairly certain of some conclusions that I will find easiest to express in negative terms based on the Plaza experience, a bit less so with some of the ones that I will express as positive. I'll start with the negatives. I'm taking a very broad view of the Plaza, not only the events in September of 1985, but the events that followed soon thereafter and the subsequent developments from those events, and indeed the academic work that it spawned and analysis that we've done since of the issues raised by Plaza. I conclude that Plaza teaches us the following. First, that it's a mistake for major countries to regard the exchange rate, either in level terms or in change terms, as a primary objective of government policy. A depreciating dollar, or those awful words, a strong dollar, are not comparable to low inflation or sustained growth or improved structural efficiency of markets as goals for economic policy. We can be misled by placing too much emphasis on the exchange rate itself in thinking about economic policy. Second, it is a mistake to view sterilized intervention as an alternative to monetary or fiscal policy. Intervention comes in various forms. The book does a good job of spelling out the analysis of those forms and the roles that they were found to have played by the academics. I will set aside unsterilized intervention because, in my mind, that's just a variant of monetary policy. But there is sterilized intervention, which can be concerted or unilateral. Intervention can be verbal. That phrase was used a lot, verbal intervention. Or it might include actual market transactions. It can be a form of signaling, which emerged from the academic studies, but that signaling might be ambiguous or it might be clear. To varying degrees, the benefit of hindsight has taught us that intervention of all these kinds does not have a long-lasting effect, but it can be shown to have a role in the short term. Regardless, intervention is not a substitute for needed monetary or fiscal policy. It is not a way of avoiding taking monetary or fiscal policy steps that are needed. Third, I think we've finally learned that it's a mistake to think that in the real world, floating exchange rates allow a country to pursue an independent monetary policy that will insulate it from the effects of others' policies. The global economy of today is sufficiently interdependent that there will be spillovers. And those spillovers will have consequences. And those consequences may require policy responses, even in the world of floating exchange rates and, in the textbook sense, independent monetary policies. And so we cannot fail to recognize that when we make the set of policy decisions with respect to monetary and fiscal policy. Fourth, policy coordination is very difficult, and it is unlikely to be fully implemented. In particular, the use of indicators, which occupied countless staff hours at central banks and finance ministries in the period. The use of these indicators to fine-tune some kind of pattern of macro policies across major countries to achieve some well-controlled outcome is wishful thinking and is well set aside. Fifth, and this one is really important, I think, implicit in a Plaza-like situation, excuse me, inevitably will be the issue of the distribution of the burdens that result from change. And resolving how this distribution of burdens will occur is never easy, and it's very unlikely to work out as it was agreed at some initial meeting. And then I offer the thought that the specific answer that worked for the global economy in 1985 is not likely to be the right answer for the problems of the global economy 30 years later. However, I have some positive thoughts as well. Short-term problems matter, and hence short-term solutions are important. So policies that have implications for the short term should be taken seriously. Conversations and contacts are important, even if one recognizes from the beginning that coordination is not going to be complete. And the Plaza and the Accord and subsequent events bore that out many times over. I think we've also learned, perhaps drawing on other experiences and pulling in other studies, central bank independence is of primary importance, and it is essential. Such independence of central banks poses substantial complexity to any policy coordination effort. Exchange markets provide useful information, and it is important to pay attention to those developments. But they reflect many, many things. They reflect capital flows. They are channels of monetary policy. They figure in trade behavior. They do all of those things simultaneously, along with all the other prices in the economy. Accordingly, the exchange rates reflect all these forces, not just any one of them. And conclusions drawn about exchange rates need to bear that in mind, because too often one approach or another is taken to the neglect of the broader picture. And finally, sometimes choice is really between, in the real world, choice is really between the lesser of two evils. And a good candidate for what is the greater of two evils is often protectionism. So it is well to bear that in mind. As a bottom line, I offer the following. Negative lessons are every bit as important as positive ones. So I think we should study the Plaza, Louvre, and subsequent years for their negative insights as well as their positive ones. Plaza-like situations are about the real world. They're not about the textbook world. They inherently involve judgments about market failures of some kind, and market failures that pose specific problems. So the policy response needs to be tailored to fit the particular problems at the particular time This makes generalizations very, very tricky. I offer an example, something that actually came up this morning in the conversation with Larry, that I see, anyway, from my perspective, having been at the Fed, as being part of the Plaza and the policy coordination effort, and that are central bank swap lines. These are sensitive, often highly charged policy tools that were created originally to provide resources for exchange market intervention. And following the period of time after Louvre, as we moved into the 1990s, when exchange market intervention became little used and basically rejected by significant players in the global scene, there was substantial discussion at all kinds of levels about whether or not we should eliminate swap lines, because they seemed to hold out the thought that we were going to intervene again. And there were a lot of people who wanted to preclude that. And eliminating swap lines would be a signal that we were precluding that. Well, in fact, that didn't happen. We did not eliminate them. And when the major country financial crisis came along, we discovered that swap lines could serve an entirely different purpose and solve an entirely different short-term problem, one that had not been foreseen. So I take this pragmatic, practical, real-world example as one showing that the kind of policies that were used at Plaza and Louvre can be very useful and need not be ones that are supported as global generalizations, but that are specific to particular problems and specific to particular points of time. Therefore, my basic message from Plaza is pragmatism. It was a set of actions directed at a set of problems. It supports the realization that the changing global economy needs leadership that is grounded in the realities of the present time, but that also evolves as the global economy evolves. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Trying to make this quick. I thought the book, the text that you put out today is just excellent. Very well done, well written. Adam Posen suggested that I sit on the panel primarily to comment on the International Monetary Conference that I envisioned and then helped organize in November of 1985. It was called the U.S. Congressional Summit on the Dollar and Trade, and sponsored by officially the congressional leadership, but essentially Bill Bradley and Jack Kemp were kind of the dominant players. Gina and John Dupre are here, who were my contacts with Senator Bradley, and it was a very interesting time. Now, this private conference, it was private, and it was achieved a far-reaching bipartisan consensus. Fred was there, and he was a major participant. But the consensus was that the era of benign neglect in exchange rates needed to end. I think as Hobart Rowan of the Washington Post wrote at the time, he said, put the final nail in the coffin of the pure floating exchange rate system. So why am I mentioning any of this? There's this argument that the Plaza was irrelevant because the dollar in the months before September 85 was weakening anyway. Here's an alternative theory. It's just a theory, but as 1985 progressed, financial markets, in my view, were receiving plenty of input that the era of benign neglect of a soaring dollar would soon be over. In early February, for example, the first week that James Baker became Ronald Reagan's second Treasury Secretary, Treasury officials initiated an early round of intervention to weaken the dollar. Around that time, we were well underway with our discussions and planning for our congressional summit. The summit was a private, nonprofit conference supported largely by financial contributors from Wall Street. What Bradley and Kemp, two prominent presidential candidates in waiting, were up to, that was big news. And there's more. In June of 85, I met with Japanese Ministry of Finance official Makoto Utsumi over at the Four Seasons Hotel in D.C., to explain the rationale for the conference. Again, this is as early as June, months before the Plaza Accord. To my surprise, within weeks, we were able to announce that the Japanese government was endorsing the conference, sending their top people. And throughout the year, there were a number of press mentions. By early September, nearly a month before the Plaza, the Wall Street Journal ran a paragraph in their front page Washington Wire section describing the conference and how it was going to be a bipartisan across-the-board attack on the whole benign neglect policy. So in the short run, the Plaza was not a fluke because the dollar was weakening. The Plaza was the culmination of efforts of kind of the political system rising up and saying, we've had enough. So as I look back on that period, it's seldom mentioned that what happened was that officials expertly managed the so-called global financial theater in influencing financial markets, and theater is important. Summers and I were talking going out. I said, the problem, I agree with you, what you said about conspiracies, but I deal with with currency traders every day. Soros and all the top guys, they always trade the conspiracy. That's the guys who make money trade the conspiracy. But if you look at the importance of theater back then, using relatively little sterilized intervention, the G5 theatrical production for financial markets proved to be highly compelling over a several year period. There was a sense the U.S. was in charge, or the G5 led by the U.S. was in charge. There was a game plan for diverting rising protectionist pressure. I used to sit in Dick Darman's office when he was Treasury Secretary. His name's not mentioned, but he was a player behind this. And that's all he talked about was theater. He was, by the way, the Ted Cruz of the 1980s, if you... No, yeah, he was not well liked. But just to give you a sense, some will say this is all nonsense. 6 months after Ben Bernanke became Fed chairman, I asked him what he found to be the biggest surprise of the job. And without hesitating, Bernanke responded, the theater. He said he always knew that management of the theater, or monetary policy, was important. He just didn't know how important. My sense is today's no one's in charge of the theater, and the theater's dark. Some say, intervention doesn't work. Is that because of the intervention policy itself or the size of global financial markets? Or is it that, our leaders, our actors, are just not that incompetent these days? Which brings us to the ultimate question of this gathering, and I guess of this afternoon's talks. Is a Plaza 2 possible? Would attempting a Plaza 2 even be advisable under today's conditions? After all, you can make an easy case currency invention is hardly a guarantee of increased net exports and enhanced prosperity. The devaluations can be diluted by the offsetting effect of global supply chains and other factors. I mean, what do we make of the less than perfect response to the yen appreciation since 2013? I read that global investors made a killing on Japanese stocks and Japanese corporate profits rose, but the little guy got killed. And the Chinese experience in the last half decade, the U.S. trade deficit in non-oil goods jumped despite the fact that the Chinese currency strengthened. I mean, I think the book explains well that the currency devaluation depends on the state of the economy, composition of its exports and imports, and the nature of the economies with which it trades, including the pricing power of exporting companies. I think Barry Eichengreen probably put it best. He said changes in exchange rates are much more likely to succeed when the emphasis on correcting exchange rate alignment with economic fundamentals, not the other way around. But even then, it's tricky with things like theater management coming into play. This room is full of some of the world's best theoretical experts on the workings of the foreign exchange system that's not me. I just deal with currency traders every day, and let me tell you how they. Well, first of all, let me say I saw a difference in the currency markets. Really, it started to occur in 1985, but it really by the turn of the century, or by the turn of the decade, it really had happened. You had currency markets which had been relatively small before the Berlin Wall fell and financial liberalization, were mostly bond traders. They tended to respond to interest differentials. And I saw during that period that with financial markets, with the foreign exchange markets suddenly becoming the main event, the big profit center, the big, huge, deep pool, so that a big hedge fund, a Soros, for instance, could play in that pool and not get caught because of the depth of those markets in the major currencies. I saw a change. You not only then had former bond traders trading foreign exchange, you had former equity traders, and a huge influx. And these traders were not as much influenced by interest differentials than they were by growth differentials. And so you had this combination of the two. And as you went from the Plaza to the Louvre and beyond, one reason intervention was difficult in the foreign exchange markets was that the markets themselves had changed. You had this combination. You had people who had looked at a lot of different things beyond, the workings of changes in interest rates, usually relative to what the Federal Reserve was up to. And I think that's one reason why markets have been fickle. It's interesting. I'll just mention this. I was in my current position now. It's over 30 years. I can't remember. I've had clients ask me almost every conceivable question. No one asked me ever what I thought about the current account deficit, ever. But I read the literature, and it's always fixates on that. But I can just tell you, the currency markets don't look at that. They look at a variety of things, but not that. Just quickly, I think today the trading community looks at the global theater, the stage of finance, and they see two main actors, the U.S. and China, and those actors would have to perform well for there to be a Plaza 2, effectively. The problem is that both actors are under tremendous emotional stress, and in the trading community, the view is that one of the actors seems on the verge of a breakdown. China, with its internal politics in turmoil, is not prepared to lead the world in anything. And would a Plaza 2 even be sustainable given the political uncertainties of China, the world's second largest economy? You can have a long-term discussion about whether we're pessimistic or optimistic about China, but I think in the last couple of years, the biggest surprise in foreign exchange has been how much the move to safety has completely dominated the thinking of the foreign exchange markets, and policymakers do various things. They expect certain results, but they do not factor in that it's a hell of a dangerous world, and the financial markets know it, and they see negative real interest rates everywhere practically, and they look and say, safety is important, and that creates some of these unpredictable capital flows that are just throwing off the policymakers, and it's why a Plaza 2 is going to be difficult. It's going to be challenging, maybe not impossible, but challenging. And I guess if you say, well, it's challenging, but what's the alternative? Thank you.
Okay, thanks to all the speakers. Floor is open for questions. In the back, up here, and we'll start with those two.
Great, thanks very much. Ted Alden from the Council on Foreign Relations. I actually want to ask the panel a pre-Plaza question, which is, how was it possible that the exchange rates got so far out of whack? Was it simply Reagan administration benign neglect? Were there other one-time forces at play? And is there any lesson there going forward? I mean, we heard from Larry Summers that the current situation probably isn't terribly out of whack, but how do we prevent another situation from arising in the future where currencies become so misaligned that something like Plaza seems necessary?
Who wants to respond? Jim?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. The analysis that we made in the IMF at the time was able to explain the movement in exchange rates up to around the middle of 1984 on the basis of what we like to call the fundamentals. And the fundamentals were partly just relative returns, relative interest rates. But what seemed to be driving that was the choice of a very different mix of policies, macro policies in the U.S. and in the other major countries. So part of what was making the U.S. economy seem to be recovering well in the early 1980s was a very tight monetary policy engineered by the legendary Paul Volcker, and a corresponding very expansionary fiscal policy under the Reagan administration. You could not have had the shift to fiscal expansion without the monetary tightening, without leading to a disastrous continuation of inflation. So the combination of those policies worked for the U.S. under the peculiar circumstances that they inherited at the beginning of the 1980s. But no other country was following that kind of a policy. So it's very clear that you could explain and you could model what was driving exchange rates through that whole period. But then something really changed around the middle of 1984. And suddenly the models that we had developed didn't explain that anymore. And it was clear that the financial markets were developing a mindset where they because they knew that there was this, I'm not sure how benign it was, but this policy of neglect on the part of the Reagan administration, they expected that to continue. They expected it to continue to lead to further increases in the value of the dollar. And so, like any classic bubble, people just started taking investment decisions on the assumption that recent trends would just continue. And so the dollar would always go up in value. Why not buy it? And that was a policy a situation that simply could not be sustained.
Ted, let me just amplify that. As you can tell from the discussion here today, economists have very different views about Plaza, the run-up, the results, and all that, as usual. But on this one point, the question you raised, I think there's unanimous agreement on what Jim just said, that the last 20, 30% run-up in the dollar in that period was pure speculative bubble. Could not be explained by any set of economic fundamentals. So it was a bubble, but it was dramatic and pervasive. I'll never forget, in January of 1985, when the dollar was peaking, I happened to be in Europe. I had discussions with Raymond Barre, who had been Prime Minister of France and authored his country's leading economics textbook, Fritz Leutwiler, who was at the time head of the Swiss National Bank, highly respected central banker. They both said, Fred, we're in a different world. The dollar will never again be below 3 marks. Well, the dollar had risen from something like 2 marks to 3.3 at the time. It peaked about 3.5. After the Plaza period, the dollar was at like 1.35. But the point was that some of the most respected, intelligent, experienced people in the world thought that what had occurred was a sea change that was going to be permanent. So it was the bubble of all bubbles, and then when it finally broke, it did change, of course, dramatically. But the agreement was speculation, bubble, extrapolation of current trends, as Jim said, and I think everybody who's studied the period agrees with that view. Yeah.
Arthur Alexander at Georgetown University. I'm wondering to what degree the willingness to go into the Plaza was kind of the last gap of the Bretton Woods system, where, we have such a great panel here, people who lived through that period. 12 years or so after the collapse of the Bretton Woods, we still have staffs, analysts, economists in the United States and elsewhere who had spent their careers defending, maintaining that system. And my question is, to what degree then did that experience inform the kinds of policies that you were willing to entertain at that time?
Yeah, if I may, I wouldn't call it the last gasp, but I think you make a very good point about the link between the collapse of the Bretton Woods system in 1973 and the effort to try to restore some kind of sanity to exchange rates in 1985. The reason I wouldn't call it the last gasp is I think it's a continuing discussion about the extent to which it makes sense to leave the determination of a very important relative price to financial markets without regard to the underlying policies that can lead to dramatic movements. I mean, I used the term earlier that the exchange rate can be hijacked by the capital market, and I think that's a very important phenomenon in today's world. And so, we went through another last gasp, if you will, in the aftermath of the Asian crisis in 1997-98, where up for a few years prior to that, there had been a huge shift in thinking, particularly around Washington and especially in the IMF, to thinking that very open capital flows, eliminate all this regulation, was the way to go, and just let exchange rates move to whatever level that might be necessary, and that if countries had strong underlying policies, that open capital markets would lead to a good solution. And after the Asian crisis, there was just a huge pullback from that. Now, was that the last gasp, or Fred has been taking his last gasp for about 30 years now, and I think, I don't see Fred going away on this issue.
But Arthur, you mischaracterize. It depends what you mean by the Bretton Woods system. Some people mean fixed exchange rates when they say the Bretton Woods system. And there was certainly no effort at the Plaza, nor was there any effort by me, to restore fixed exchange rates. Mulford stresses in his chapter in the book, and he was the main operational architect, that full respect for markets, recognizing how they did overshoot, and so the objective was to correct the overshoot, but there was no effort to restore fixed rates, if that's what you mean by the Bretton Woods system. Now, it's true, the Louvre Agreement, when there was fear that the rates were going back excessively in the other direction, did try to put in a target zone system with fairly wide bands, so you might say that was an effort at a compromise. And some people, including some of us here, had in mind something like that. That's what Darman actually wanted to put in place. It held for a little while, but not for too long, and basically the lesson was that it was too hard to carry out. Now, if you mean by the Bretton Woods system the broader context of monetary cooperation among leading countries, then, as we point out in the overview chapter in the volume, Plaza, Louvre, the whole period was an effort to restore a more active system of policy cooperation among the major countries. And that was important because, as some of us have said, The first Reagan administration was the absolute opposite. I mean, benign neglect of the dollar, but absolute opposition to international economic cooperation. And I put that explicitly. I mean, Beryl Sprinkle succeeded me at the Treasury and literally would have liked to pull the U.S. out of the International Monetary Fund if he could have gotten away with it, and viewed intervention as the evil of all evils, and actually gave away the foreign exchange that he had inherited from my Treasury when they had to pay into the IMF for a quota increase, so that they wouldn't be tempted ever in the future to intervene. So the U.S., far from being a leader of international economic cooperation, went to the exact opposite degree and actually rejected the concept of international economic cooperation. So in that sense, the Baker Treasury and the Plaza period was an effort to restore not only some cooperation in the global economy, but U.S. leadership thereof. When Jim talked about leadership in his remarks as a lesson, he talked about G5, G7. I draw 6 lessons from it in my paper, in my chapter in the book. And to me, lesson number 1 was you have to have leadership, but by that I meant U.S. leadership. Because my conclusion was that without U.S. leadership, none of that was going to happen. And I think the Plaza and the whole period exemplified that. So again, it depends what you mean. Certainly not fixed rates, but broader cooperation, yes, indeed, was a fundamental objective. And if you read Baker is very interesting on this. And Baker, in his keynote speech at the Houston conference, reiterated his strong view that you got to go back to that. We need it today. Big gap in the system today, and Baker felt very strongly about that and tried to achieve it. Karen, please.
The major problem preoccupying economic policy during the 1970s was not the gradual crumbling, or maybe even the not gradual crumbling of the Bretton Woods system. It was the U.S. inflation rate. By the time Paul Volcker became chairman of the Federal Reserve, the U.S. had totally lost its national respect, and the Federal Reserve was thought to be failing in its responsibility to produce good monetary policy.
Turn on the mic.
In the United States and outside of the United States.
Karen, please turn on the mic. We want to record your remarks.
Oh, I'm sorry. My apologies. So my point is that the problem of the 1970s and the problem that confronted us in the very early 80s was the very high rate to which U.S. inflation had risen, and the fact that that had totally undermined the credibility of the Federal Reserve, both at home and abroad, as capable of delivering good monetary policy. And I think the role of the U.S. as the country that should be providing international leadership, because it was seen to be the cause of the breakdown of the Bretton Woods the failure of the Bretton Woods didn't cause U.S. inflation, rather the reverse, in many people's minds. So the tension that existed because of the tight monetary and easy fiscal policy that Jim quite correctly pointed out was the consequence of vocal monetary policy. And the subsequent attempts, like by Plaza say, was to figure out how, if we have solved the U.S. monetary policy problem and we've gotten U.S. inflation under control, how do we get back to something more normal? And Plaza was a piece of how you get back to something more normal.
Can I add something on this?
Sure, David.
Yeah, on this, I call it the Greenspan thesis on why the dollar soared and the economy was increasingly robust at the time. His argument is that it was not just fiscal and monetary policies, but that by the early 80s and certainly the late 70s, there was a global consensus that American industry was discredited. American corporations were dinosaurs. The German and Japanese corporate models, they were the future. And I always found this amazing, but Greenspan argued, or still argues, that when Ronald Reagan fired the air traffic controllers, it was a paradigm shift And he said he was in private consulting business with a lot of corporate clients, and he said they were intensely interested in this because if Reagan pulled this off, there was no general strike of the transportation system in the U.S. and everything shut down. It was an indication that labor was willing to cooperate, or at least look the other way, in a massive U.S. corporate restructuring. And that's essentially what happened. And that corporate restructuring was shocking to the international system. Senator Bill Brock, who went on to be Reagan's first trade negotiator, told me not long ago, he said, because we were talking about this, and he said, when I went to Tokyo for my first round of negotiations, it was prior to the air traffic controllers incident. And the Japanese officials he sat down with were smug and dismissive. And then his second trip came after the Greenspan thesis set in. He said it was a sea change. It was, well, we can work this out. Let's cooperate. We're all together. So I mentioned that because it's anecdotal, but I was always struck by Greenspan's sense of that.
Time for maybe one more question, Gina.
In terms of why a politician like Bill Bradley would have spent the amount of time and political capital that he did on an issue as technical and as alien to public discourse as exchange rates. And Dave talked about theater. At the time, you had congressmen taking Japanese cars, having Japanese cars deposited on the steps of the U.S. Capitol and whacking them to pieces with sledgehammers. And the fear that people like Bill, and I assume Jack Kemp had too, and it comes back to the short-term nature of it all, they were really afraid that this animosity would lead to serious protectionist legislation, and that the costs of allowing this to come into being would be a return to the 30s. This was sort of the mindset at the time. So whether you could ever see a need for another Plaza Accord, it seems to me that were we to get into a situation where China was perceived the way Japan was in the 80s, and whether it was due to the perception that it was Chinese exchange rate manipulation that was the cause, I could see the reaction from Congress, and depending on who is president, giving rise on the part of some of the more thoughtful and intelligent politicians that a Plaza Accord type initiative was necessary to head off something absolutely horrendous. So I think the jury's out on what we're going to see in the next few years.
We're going to turn to that question this afternoon. Is there a need for a Plaza 2? I want to wrap up this session now. I'm not sure the panel clearly answered the question, did the Plaza succeed? I would just say in 10 seconds, the exchange rates did change enormously, and the misalignments clearly were corrected. The current account imbalances did come down dramatically, not back to where they started, but by about 50%. And the protectionist pressures that you describe were in fact fought off, and by the time Congress finally passed the trade bill 3 years later, it did nothing damaging to U.S. trade policy or the world system. So in those senses, which I think were the three fundamental goals of the Plaza Agreement, it worked. Whether the Plaza ought to get credit for it or not is debatable, but the outcome was as sought by Baker, his team, the second Reagan administration. So I think in that sense, it's fair to say the Plaza was a success. Adam.
Thank you so much, Fred. Thank you, James, Russell, Karen, and David, for what was terrific. The people who made this happen and who saw the insights in real time. but also the historic perspective. You have all earned a free lunch. I'd like to invite everyone to that lunch. We will reconvene in a half an hour for the forward-looking panel emphasizing today, although, of course, this panel certainly had forward-looking implications. Just a reminder that we are distributing today and available for sale on the web is International Monetary Cooperation, Lessons from the Plaza Accord After 30 Years. And as a special bonus, we are also making available the classic that Fred and Larry Summers earlier mentioned, Managing the Dollar from the Plaza to the Louvre. Buy them both, get a discount. The Amazon.com of the Peterson Institute goes forward. Anyway, thank you all very much. We look forward to reconvening in a half hour.
Thanks to all.